Hello, welcome to Z Marie Design. Let's create a keepsake wedding garter from a men's tie. So to get started, you'll need a tie, some lace, charms or bows, and your elastic. So let's get started. I'm going to take my measurement around my thigh, measuring 3 inches above my knee. My measurement came to 18. I'm going to multiply that by 1.5. That gives me 27 inches. I add 1 inch for seam allowance, so my total is 28. So I'm going to take that measurement of 28 inches and I'm going to cut that from the smallest part of the tie. I'm going to cut off the tip of the tie to give myself a straight edge. And I will take my measurement from that straight edge all the way down to 28 inches and then cut my tie. Now at this point you could just insert your elastic right through the opening on one end and through the other end, but the back stitching is not held together very well. It's very loose, so when you put the elastic through, it's going to pop that seam open. So we are going to just seam rip that seam and we will sew another straight seam to make it very sturdy. So to remove those back stitching, I'm going to use my seam ripper to do that. And if your tie tack is still there, go ahead and remove your tie tack with your seam ripper as well. So now that my stitching has been removed, I'm also going to remove that interfacing inside the tie because it gets very bulky and you don't want that much bulk on your leg. We will replace that with some lightweight fusible interfacing so that the tie can be a bit sturdy. Now my tie measures 3.5 inches in width. Yours might be a little wider or a little thinner. And I'll show you how to take your measurements with your elastic in a few steps. So now that my tie has been pressed completely open, if there is any interfacing that still remains, go ahead and seam rip that out like this black piece there and press those seams open. Now I want to fuse my fusible interfacing to the wrong side of the tie, and you just follow your manufacturer's instructions to fuse your interfacing. My interfacing measures 2.5 inches just to reduce the bulk in the seam allowance. I'm just going to use some of the scraps of my fusible that I have in my stash. And just fuse down the entire length of the tie. So now everything is pressed and fused. I just want to make sure that the width of my tie is the same all the way through the entire length. So I'm just folding it right sides facing just so I can trim it up. You don't have to be completely accurate at this point, but just fairly close. Now the next step I'm going to take is to fold it in half and press it so that I know that my raw edges are meeting. Make it easier for me to pin it down. And I'm also going to fold in the short ends of the seam allowance, a 1/2 inch on both sides of the short ends. Right sides facing, I'm going to pin everything in place down the entire length of the tie. Now before I sew my seam, I just want to make sure that the width of my elastic is going to fit snugly inside my tie. So I'm going to lay my elastic down on top of the fold here, and I want to make sure that I have at least a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both sides of the elastic. My elastic is 5/8 inches in width. Yours might be a little wider, it might be a little thinner. So just lay it down on top of your tie and just measure so that you have about a 1/4 inch on each side. So I'm going to sew along that raw edge, which was a 1/2 inch seam allowance, all the way down the length of the tie. And I make sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end of that seam. So now that my seam has been sewn all the way down, and I have opening on each of the short ends, I'm going to trim this seam back to a 1/4 inch, and I'm going to use my pinking shears just to help reduce the fraying on this seam. Even though the seam will be on the inside, I still want to help reduce some of the fraying of that fabric. So now it's time to turn it right side out. I'm going to use my bodkin. You can also use a safety pin. Just insert your safety pin inside your tie. I'm just going to tack my bodkin down and then turn it right side out. And as I turn it right side out, it takes just a minute or so to get it through, turning it under, and just being very careful not to lift up my fusible interfacing. And just continue to work it down, turning it right side out. Now that everything has been turned right side out, I'm going to make sure that that seam allowance that I pressed under is turned to the inside. Removing my bodkin, or remove your safety pin, making sure that the seam allowance is still turned under. And then I will give this a good press again. Now you can press your seam to the center back. I'm just going to press my seam to one side and just getting that bodkin in there to push that seam completely open. Give it a really good press all the way down the length of the tie. Now that everything has been pressed out, I'm going to determine which side do I want for the outside of the garter, which side of the tie I want for the inside of the garter. So I think I want this side to be on the outside of the garter. I'm going to mark it with my chalk so I don't forget. Now I'm going to attach my lace. I'm going to attach my lace to the underside of the tie, and I'm going to lay the seam allowance, making sure that my lace is right side up. I'm going to lay the tie right within the seam allowance on the lace. I'm going to lay it down on one end all the way and pinning it in place all the way to the length of the tie. And she'll look like this from the back once you lay it down within the seam allowance on the lace. And I'm going to pin it in place because I'm going to top stitch this lace down, and make sure that you match your thread to the color of your tie, because then those top stitching it'll just be almost invisible. So this is what it should look like when you've pinned it in place. Now I'm not going to sew from the back. I'm going to sew it from the front because I don't want the tie to get snagged in the feed dogs. So I want to be able to see it and control those stitches. So I'm going to sew about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the tie, catching that seam allowance of the lace. And I'm going to increase my stitch length to 3.0 to 3.5, all the way down the length of the tie. Now I put that lace at the edge that has the seam. And then now the edge that has the fold is the top. But now I have some additional lace left. I just want to lay it down just to see how it would look if I put the lace at the top, which is the folded side of the tie. And I think I'm kind of liking this. I didn't do that on my first sample, but I think I'm kind of liking how this looks. So I'm going to continue to pin this in place. So now that it's pinned in place at the top, I really like that look of what it's going to look like when as a garter with the lace at the top and the bottom. So I will just go ahead and top stitch this lace in place at the top. So now that my lace is top stitched on both the top and the bottom, I'm going to measure my elastic. Now the measurement of my initial measurement was 18 inches. I'm going to subtract at least 3 to 4 inches off of that, which makes it 15. And I'm going to thread my elastic through. You want to make sure that you have a heavy duty elastic that's going to hold up on the thigh with movement, with walking, with dancing. So making sure that your elastic has a lot of strength to it. I attached it to my bodkin. If you're using safety pin, just attach it to that and just feed it all the way through one end, all the way through to the other end. But as you're feeding it through, make sure that you are watching that end that you initially came in through so that your elastic doesn't get lost in there. So go ahead and pin it down as it gets closer to the entrance of your tie. Continue to work your way through and pulling it out of the opposite end. Now you'll have a chance once again to measure this around your thigh if you're making this for yourself, to see if you like how tight it is. If not, you can keep that to keep it as loose as possible as you like, or to make it tighter if you like. So now once you have it fed through, you're going to pin it in place and you'll take it to your sewing machine, tuck it inside the seam allowance, and you will sew across one edge. Now before you sew the opposite edge, just go ahead and measure it on your thigh. You have one side sewn, measure it on your thigh to see if you need to adjust. Now I'm just wrapping it around my arm to show you, to see if you need to adjust the elastic. If you want it a little bit tighter, go ahead and pull the elastic out and cut it off at this point before you sew down the final opening. So I'm going to go ahead and take several stitches on the opening there. And now that the elastic has been inserted into my tie and the openings have been sewn closed, you don't have a raw edge because we tucked in that seam allowance. Just trim up all your threads. We're going to turn it right sides facing, and I'm going to pin in place right sides facing, and I'm going to take a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to sew this about 3 times to make sure that it is secure. And I don't sew my lace closed. I'm just sewing along the tie back and forth at least 3 to 4 times. 1/2 inch seam allowance. So now you have your 1/2 inch seam allowance. Your garter is starting to look like a garter. I want you to now do some hand tack. You're going to hand tack that seam allowance that you have there. Hand tack it to one side. That's so it can lie flat against the leg, and it'll make it a lot more comfortable. So just a few slip stitches, and once again matching your thread to your necktie. And these little few stitches that you're going to put in here, they're going to just be invisible. But just hand tack that seam allowance down. That's why we took a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So you have enough on each side to hand tack it down and make it look very professional. So I'm just putting a few little slip stitches, and once again I'm not sewing the lace, I'm just sewing the tie. And I'm not going all the way through to the front part of the tie. I'm just taking my stitches through the back part of the tie and the seam allowance. And we're almost done once you're done with this. And I just bury my threads in between the fabric before I cut it. I do that on both sides of the seam allowance. So now the next step is the fun part. Well, it's all been fun, but this is the best part. Attaching your charms or your bows. Now you can make your bow from scratch. I just purchased these at my local craft store. And I'm going to make sure all my threads are clipped. I'm going to turn it right side out. Find the center. And I'm going to mark it with my chalk and attach my bow. You can attach your bow, you can attach charms. This is a great place to put maybe a brooch. You can put more than one bow, more than one charm, whichever you prefer. And now that you've done that, your keepsake garter is all done. A great way to have a loved one who has passed on to be with you in a wedding. And I hope you like this project. I hope you give it a try. Thanks for watching.